Essentially, the amount of muscle growth we see probably follows the diminishing returns principle. This means the more time and effort we put towards our training, the less additional muscle growth we experience. This doesn't mean that more effort doesn't result in greater results, it just means that there will be less additional gain. So basically, we want to know how much time and effort we need to put to achieve decent gains, so around this area here, but not absolutely maximal gains at this area here. Also, I should note that the phrase time and effort is very vague, but it should become more clear what this means throughout the rest of this video. So, it is certainly possible to achieve long-term muscle growth with substantially less time and effort than what is deemed optimal. The difference is the rate of muscle growth that will be achieved. You may build muscle at a slightly slower rate over time, but it can definitely still occur. Whereas taking care of every nuanced detail regarding training and nutrition for muscle growth will likely result in a faster rate of growth. Continuing on from this discussion, the other major factor at play here is lifting consistency. In other words, how long we lift for. Even if our rate of muscle growth is slightly slower, we can still build significant muscle mass if we are consistent for a long time. For example, let's say we have a lifter who does all the basics well for 10 years consistently without being too concerned about the minute details. Whereas a different lifter puts much more time and effort into every little detail, but only trains for 3 years. In most cases, the lifter training consistently for longer will probably see greater overall muscle growth as a result of their long-term consistency. Now getting into the actual training recommendations, the first factor we need to understand is the relationship between quality versus quantity. Training quality can be thought of as the hypertrophic stimulus per set. This encompasses multiple components, which we will cover shortly. Quantity, on the other hand, simply refers to volume, which in this case refers to the total number of sets performed per muscle group per week. Both sides of this equation are important. If we can improve training quality, we can achieve more muscle growth with the same amount of work, and if we increase training quantity, we have more total work for any given muscle. For example, we will achieve a superior hypertrophic stimulus with 3 high-quality sets compared with 3 low-quality sets. However, we could make up for this by performing 5 sets instead of 3, resulting in similar muscle growth. And we will likely provide an even better stimulus by performing 5 high-quality sets. So quite clearly, we want to maximize our training quality to improve our training efficiency. If we get a better stimulus with each set, we can achieve similar muscle growth with less time and effort. There are 3 primary variables that will influence training quality. First is proximity to failure. This refers to how close to failure each set is taken. I would hypothesize that the relationship between proximity to failure and muscle growth probably looks something like this. We need to train at least fairly close to failure to induce enough stress to disrupt homeostasis. But as we get closer to failure, there seems to be less additional benefit between complete failure versus leaving a couple of reps in the tank each set. This was confirmed by this meta-analysis, which compared the effects of training to failure versus not to failure on muscle growth. The researchers established a similar graph showing diminishing returns as we train very close to failure. Furthermore, training to failure also takes more effort and usually results in greater psychological and physiological fatigue. So if we are going for a great stimulus with the least amount of effort, I would say that we probably want to train close to failure, but not to complete failure. As a practical guide, I would recommend training with around 2 to 4 reps in reserve for most compound lifts and around 1 to 3 reps in reserve for most isolation lifts. And for the last set of some exercises, it may be worthwhile to take it to true failure, as long as it is safe to do so. This is probably the best balance of stimulus versus effort in most cases. The next factor influencing training quality is lifting technique. For hypertrophy purposes, resistance training should be performed in a way that maximizes stress on the target muscle. In general, we achieve the best hypertrophic stimulus by training with strict technique, full range of motion, and a controlled eccentric tempo. So even if we perform the same number of sets, the target muscle may be more or less stressed based on the technique used. This can influence the muscle growth we achieve from our training routine without changing any specific variables on paper. This also doesn't really require any more time and effort. Rather, we are just being more intentional with each set by actively trying to train a specific muscle. So I think all trainees, regardless of how much time and effort they are willing to train with, should intentionally focus on perfecting technique across their training career to maximize the quality of each set. And the last primary component of training quality is exercise selection. Muscle growth can be achieved using a large range of different exercises, and there are no mandatory exercises that everyone must perform. This is because resistance exercises are simply means to stress our muscle. However, some exercises may be slightly more effective than others based on a few factors. An example of exercise effectiveness can be seen in this study. Trainees performed 5 sets of leg curls 2 times per week for 12 weeks. One group performed seated leg curls while the other group performed lying leg curls. At the end of the training intervention, it was found that the group performing seated leg curls saw greater growth of the hamstrings, shown in the blue bars, compared with the lying leg curls, shown in the orange bars. This study, in conjunction with other recent evidence, tends to show that training a muscle at longer lengths appears to be slightly more hypertrophic compared with training at a shorter length. So trainees may want to preference exercises which stress the target muscle at longer lengths if they have the option to do so. Furthermore, each individual is slightly unique in their anatomical structure. There is fairly wide variability between individuals' muscle insertion points, muscle fiber orientation, and bone structure. These variables can have an influence on which exercises are more or less effective to hit each muscle. There is no specific method to calculate which exercises are best for each person, so trial and error is required to guide you in the right direction. Trainees can use sensations like the mind-muscle connection, muscle pump, and muscle soreness to determine which exercises tend to provide a good stimulus for them. So basically, the exercises we implement can have an influence on training quality. If we select movements that are more effective, we can achieve a superior hypertrophy stimulus per set. This can help us achieve more muscle growth per set without any additional time or effort required. Now let's move on to volume. As mentioned earlier, volume in the context of hypertrophy training refers to the total number of sets performed per muscle group per week. The first factor we need to consider is how much volume is required to at least maintain our current muscle mass. So assuming training quality is still high, how much can we reduce our volume without losing muscle? This threshold was explored in this study. Trainees performed a leg training routine across a 48-week time frame. For the first 16 weeks, trainees performed 3 sets of squats, leg press, and leg extensions for 8 to 12 reps, 3 times per week. This equates to a total of 27 sets of quad training. Then, across the following 32 weeks, trainees were assigned to different volumes of training to see what would happen to leg muscle mass. One group performed no further training at all, another group performed 1/3 of the previously used volume by performing only 1 session per week, and another group performed 1/9 of the previous volume by performing 1 session and only 1 set of each exercise. As expected, trainees saw increases in quad muscle fiber size after this 16-week training program, although during the maintenance phase, results were different between groups. The D-training group, performing no training in the blue, saw a consistent decrease in muscle size, as expected. The group training with 1/9 of the initial volume in the green were able to approximately maintain muscle size over the next 32 weeks. And the group training with 1/3 of the initial volume in the orange continued to see muscle growth for the next 16 weeks before seeing a slight reduction in muscle size. So it seems that muscle mass can be maintained with much lower volumes compared with what it takes to build significant muscle mass. It is difficult to give exact recommendations, but based on this research, we can probably maintain our muscle mass for multiple months with only 1/3 of our regular volume, and possibly even less than this. This brings us to the next important discussion, which is how much volume above maintenance is required to start building muscle mass. Before discussing this concept, I need to give credit to Dr. Mike Israetel from Renaissance Periodization for establishing this terminology. Basically, the minimum effective volume is the least amount of volume required to start building some amount of muscle mass. So we need to surpass this minimum volume threshold to start seeing muscle growth over time. It doesn't mean muscle growth is maximal, but it is enough to see some gains over time. Now, it is very difficult to give exact volume recommendations here because it can vary substantially between individuals. In general, lower minimum volumes are required for those who train with higher quality sets, who have less lifting experience, and who are genetically responsive to training. On the other hand, higher minimum volumes are usually required for those training with less quality per set, who are more experienced, and who are genetically less responsive to training. So it is impossible to give any specific recommendations here, but trainees can use trial and error to determine what the minimum amount of volume they require to see any marginal gains in muscle mass. So once we have tapped into this minimum effective volume, we are building muscle mass to some extent. Now the question becomes, how much volume should we train with? To answer this, let's look at how volume influences muscle growth on a global scale. The best evidence we have on this topic is this systematic review, which analysed the effects of low versus moderate versus high training volumes on muscle growth. The authors categorized low volumes as less than 12 sets per muscle group per week, moderate volumes as 12 to 20 sets, and high volume as greater than 20 sets per week. It was found that moderate volume training was significantly superior to low volume training, as expected. However, high volume training tended to be only marginally superior to moderate volume, only reaching statistical significance for the triceps. So what this tells us is that there is probably a diminishing returns response with regards to volume. More volume tends to result in greater muscle growth, but each additional set is probably less additionally hypertrophic. So for those who want to make good progress without too much time and effort, it may be worth training with a more low to moderate volume. And for those who want to maximize muscle growth, it will require more time and effort, but higher volumes may be necessary. Another factor relevant to this discussion is lifting experience. As we build muscle over our training career, the threshold for adaptation increases. We need to increase our quality and/or quantity of training to continue making progress over time. A beginner can do almost anything in the gym and make progress because their baseline is 0. So any additional stimulus will be enough to elicit a novel adaptation. As we become more advanced, this threshold increases. We may need more volume to continue building muscle, or we may need to improve our training quality to achieve a superior stimulus per set. Thankfully, lifters usually improve quality over time by improving technique, individualizing exercise selection, and making each rep maximally stimulative. So volume requirements probably don't continue to increase beyond extreme levels. They may just increase slightly over time after your beginner phase in the gym. An example demonstrating this can be seen in this meta-analysis on proximity to failure. Overall, training to failure seemed to be slightly superior compared with not training to failure for muscle growth, as we established earlier in this video. The important point with this paper was a subgroup analysis which showed that training to failure had a greater positive effect on muscle growth in trained lifters compared with untrained lifters. This is likely because trainees with more experience require a higher threshold for adaptation compared with novices. This all relates back to the minimum training requirements for muscle growth. Someone who is more experienced may have a higher minimum threshold compared with a less experienced lifter. So there is no universal recommendation we can apply to everyone. It needs to be tailored based on lifting experience and individual variation. There are also many other external variables which can influence the least amount of training required for muscle growth. While we can't cover every single external variable in this video, we will cover a few of the main ones that influence minimal training requirements. First is our calorie intake. While muscle growth can be achieved with a deficit, the magnitude of muscle growth is likely to be greater in a surplus, or at least at maintenance calories. A surplus seems to provide a more anabolic environment, while a deficit seems to be less of an anabolic environment, with maintenance calories being somewhere in between. So if we provide the same training stimulus, it may be enough to build muscle in a surplus, but may only be enough to maintain muscle mass during a deficit, or may even result in some slight muscle loss. So it should just be understood that our current calorie intake may have an influence on what amount of training is required to build muscle, and may change based on our nutritional status. The other major nutritional consideration is our total daily protein intake. It is well established that higher daily protein intakes tend to result in superior muscle growth. However, similar to the volume discussion, there seems to be diminishing returns. This was established in this meta-analysis, which attempted to establish the relationship between protein intake and muscle growth. This data was analysed using different statistics and between different populations, but the same general trend was found. In general, higher protein intakes tended to result in superior muscle growth from resistance training, but there seems to be diminishing returns. And the protein threshold to achieve the majority of benefits seems to not be all that high. As long as you were intaking at least around 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram per day, you were probably getting the majority of benefits. So this data relates to the topic of this video in two ways. First is that our total daily protein intake may influence the minimum training requirements for muscle growth. The same training protocol may result in more muscle growth when combined with a high protein diet, and may result in less muscle growth or potentially no growth when combined with a lower protein diet. And second is that trainees probably don't need to consume excessively high protein diets to build muscle. This may be appealing because it will usually take more time and effort to intentionally consume a very high protein diet. It may require more meticulous effort to seek high protein meals, it may require more meal preparation and storage, and will usually be more expensive. So trainees may opt to try and hit a minimum of around 1.3 to 1.5 grams per kilogram per day to achieve the majority of benefit with less overall time and effort. Whereas someone who is willing to put more time and effort into building muscle mass may opt to hit at least 2 grams per kilogram per day or more for a small additional benefit. And lastly, let's discuss sleep. It is a very common claim that improving sleep quality and quantity will drastically improve your muscle growth response from resistance training. However, there is surprisingly little evidence providing convincing support for this claim. The only solid direct evidence I could find for this claim was this study, which compared different sleep durations on body composition changes during a calorie deficit. Subjects underwent a 14-day calorie deficit, with one group allowed 8.5 hours of sleep per night, and the other group restricted to only 5.5 hours per night. After 2 weeks, both groups lost a similar amount of total body weight, but body composition changes were different. The group sleeping longer saw greater fat loss and less muscle loss, as shown in the blue bars, while the restricted sleep group lost less fat and more muscle tissue. It should be noted that these were overweight adults with no training conducted during the study, which are some major caveats to these results. However, rather than the physiological detriments that restricted sleep may have for muscle growth, I think that sleep can have bigger negative consequences on muscle growth from a behavioural perspective. We don't need research to tell us that multiple nights of poor sleep has detrimental effects on our mood, motivation, and cognitive function. Therefore, without external stimulants such as caffeine, poor sleep will probably cause us to put less effort and intent into our training sessions, and may even cause us to skip workouts. So overall, I think that high quality and quantity of sleep does seem to be beneficial for muscle growth, whether that is direct or indirect. Therefore, it should be understood that the minimum dose of training required for muscle growth may be impacted by our sleeping behaviours. Taking all of this information into consideration, let's now establish some practical recommendations. It is difficult to provide concrete recommendations as to what is the least amount of training required to build muscle. This is because it depends on many different variables. However, here are some very general recommendations that may be applicable to the average intermediate lifter. First, lifters should focus on performing each set with high quality. This means taking each set close to failure, around 1 to 3 reps in reserve on average, maybe taking the last set of isolation lifts to true failure every now and again. It also means training with effective technique, meaning using strict form, full range of motion, and controlling the eccentric portion. Furthermore, trainees should try to select exercises which are effective at promoting muscle growth based on muscle anatomy and based on their own perceived stimulus. So, assuming we are training with high quality, we can now give some volume recommendations. Minimum volume requirements can be highly individual, but I would speculate that the lowest average volume most intermediate lifters require to achieve some sort of long-term muscle growth is probably around 5 to 8 sets per muscle group per week. However, this number can be very different based on your individual responsiveness to training, your training history, and your level of advancement. So use this as a starting point and individualized based on your response. Furthermore, these general figures may change based on dietary factors. In terms of calorie intake, a surplus may lower our minimum requirements for muscle growth, while a deficit may increase our minimum requirements for muscle growth. In terms of protein intake, getting a moderately high protein intake in your diet, around 1.5 grams per kilogram per day, seems to be sufficient to achieve great gains over time. Although, if you want to maximize muscle growth, a higher intake may be required, but will only yield slightly greater gains over time. And lastly, external factors such as sleep may also influence your ability to build muscle with a given training protocol. Although the research is not conclusive, getting good quality and quantity of sleep seems to provide a slightly more anabolic environment, while poor sleep may inhibit growth to some extent. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.